bit rainy out there, so thanks for joining us for those that are here in the room. We have one of our speakers who's dealing with the challenge of getting here in an Uber while there's she needs an Uber boat instead of a regular Uber to get here. But she'll be here in just a few minutes and will join us on the panel. But we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a webcast audience as well as C-SPAN is covering us today, so we're going to go ahead and just get going. Thank you all for braving the weather and joining us today. We really appreciate that. And our final panelist is actually here right now. Yeah. So welcome, Blanca. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, a year ago, on July 1, Andrés Manuel López Obrador won in a landslide election in Mexico. He earned 53% of the votes, and that was 30 points higher than the second place candidate. So it truly was a landslide victory. AMLO's party, Morena, which was created by him just a few years ago, swept the congressional elections, winning in partnership with allied parties a majority in both the lower house and the Senate in Mexico. It was a stunning victory for both AMLO and Morena, and really a spectacular defeat also for the other parties in Mexico, for the PAN, as well as the PRI, who together had ruled Mexico for about the last 90 years. So this was a really significant change. I was in Cuernavaca and in Mexico City last year on the day of the elections, going around, talking to people, watching the elections unfold. And it was really remarkable to witness the level of optimism that existed on that day, July 1, a year ago in Mexico. You know, the sense that they were electing, the Mexican electorate was electing someone who could be trusted, who was different in many ways than those who had been in power in the previous several administrations, someone who really represented them rather than the elites in Mexico, someone who would fight for the common person. It was actually inspiring to see that level of optimism and be a part of that day. It was clear to me as a result of that also just how disenfranchised many in Mexico had felt. You know, this is the first president who has come from the left in Mexico since there have been what we could consider democratic elections in Mexico. So there was a portion of the electorate, a significant portion of the electorate, that had really felt disenfranchised and excluded from this democratic process because they hadn't had representation at the highest level in Mexico. And that changed as a result of these, groundbreaking elections in Mexico. There's also, as many of us know, stubbornly high levels of poverty and inequality in Mexico. And therefore, another big portion of the population that feels excluded and disenfranchised as a result of that. And so this was also a president who was elected on a promise to reduce inequality and fight poverty in Mexico. And again, leading people to feel more a part of the system, that they had representation at the highest level, people that previously felt excluded. But now, it's 1 year later. It's really about 6 months into the presidency itself because there's such a long transition period in Mexico. AMLO took office in December of last year. But people had very high expectations for this administration, for the sexenio, the 6-year period. And the question now is, are those expectations being met? Are we on a path towards the meeting of those high expectations? We have some great analysts here to help us analyze different aspects of how you could think about and respond to that question of how is it going so far. I mean, that's the general question of today, but there are many ways to reflect on that. In terms of public opinion, the general sense is that AMLO continues to have a honeymoon period. He continues to have very high overall levels of popularity, and we're really delighted to have Jorge Buendia, who's an expert in public opinion in Mexico, a pollster in Mexico, also a global fellow with us here at the Mexico Institute, to have him join us today to look at some of the issues surrounding and look in more depth at the numbers in terms of public opinion. I think there may be some cracks in the veneer on specific policy issues, specific things that the administration has been undertaking that have less support than the overall level of support for the president, but it'll be interesting to look into that more carefully. The centerpiece of AMLO's campaign was an anti-corruption platform. He was somebody that could be trusted more than the other candidates in the other parties, and he's someone who would tackle the high levels of corruption that have been a challenge for Mexico in terms of general public administration, and then also very much in terms of impunity and public security in Mexico as well. And so we're delighted to have with us also Maria Amparo Casar, who's the executive president of Mexicanos contra la Corrupción, Mexicans Against Corruption, to reflect on progress made thus far. Thanks so much for joining us. Maria Amparo is also a board member of ours at the Mexico Institute. Thanks for coming. AMLO promised more than just a change of the party in power. He promised a fourth transformation of Mexico, a transformation of Mexico on par with independence from Spain, on par with the creation of a constitution and the liberalizing reforms of the 1860s, on par with the Mexican Revolution that ran from 1910 on to maybe 1920. Those are huge levels of change that he's promising, right? He's talked about regime change rather than just a change in the party that's in power, a change in the structure and the way in which Mexico is governed, a representation of those who had been disenfranchised, fighting poverty and inequality and corruption, fighting that stranglehold on power of what he described as the mafia del poder, the mafia of power. Those elites, as he described it, that ruled Mexico rather than the people, saying that it wasn't essentially a true democracy. And so he promises to make it a true democracy in that sense. We are delighted to have with us Blanca Heredia. I'm gonna give you, that was a big issue area for me to lay in front of you to tackle, but I'm gonna ask you, how is that fourth transformation going basically? That's the general question there for you. It's obviously a massive one. And finally, last but not least, Antonio Ortiz Mena, we're going to look at the Mexican economy as a piece of this as well. And Antonio works at Albright Stonebridge these days as senior vice president there, covering issues related to Mexico, but has also been at the Mexican embassy. He was for a long time in charge of economic affairs there. In terms of the Mexican economy, I mean, if we look in the long term, it's been a really mixed story, right? Mexico has very successfully integrated into the global economy, become a global manufacturing powerhouse, but at the same time has levels of poverty and inequality, as I've mentioned, that remain quite high. And so to have someone, as part of the victory over the last 20 years in the Mexican economy has been achieving macroeconomic stability through the independence of the central bank and fiscal responsibility across party lines in terms of administrations. Well, we have now a president of Mexico who promises to maintain fiscal responsibility, promises to keep those things that worked well in some ways, but to change things dramatically in other ways. And so I think there's a lot to dig into in terms of both how investors are seeing Mexico from the outside, the slowdown in the Mexican economy that's been underway, how is that impacting the ability of this administration to implement some of the social spending that it hopes to do, some of the infrastructure projects it hopes to accomplish. Pemex, the state oil company, is facing pretty serious challenges these days. How does that fit into the economic picture and plans of the administration? We're really looking forward to that. All of our panelists have an interesting connection, which is that they've all at some point, either currently or in their past, been affiliated with CIDE, one of the great research institutions and universities in Mexico City. So we have a panel that is both very diverse in many ways, but with a common thread running throughout it as well. And we're just delighted to have all of you with us today. And I'm going to ask Jorge if you could start. We have a presentation with a few slides. Just Jorge's going to do some slides because he's doing public opinion and it really makes sense to. And then we'll move into some opening statements by our other panelists and then have some time for discussion among us and with all of you. So think about your questions as we're moving through. But Jorge, the floor is yours.
Okay. I think that, well, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here again. I think the interesting question is how popular is really López Obrador, because everybody says that, oh, he's really popular, he's charismatic, and sometimes we forget that he competed in 2006 and 2012, and he got more or less around 1/3 of support from the Mexican population. So we have to put in context what has happened with the image of López Obrador, because he certainly is charismatic, but he wasn't as popular as he is. So I'm going to try to put in context the López Obrador approval levels, popularity, and in that sense to generate a discussion about his strength among the Mexican public. This is the poll of polls. Well, here at the center, they have my presentation. They can share it. But many of the numbers here are available at the polling aggregator oraculus.mx. So many of the figures that I'm going to be showing are already in the public domain. So this is the poll of polls. Right now, the average is 70% of approval and 25% of disapproval. There are differences among polling firms, and this is the most recent number that we have, but we can expect that certainly he right now should be between 60 and 70% approval level, that especially if you compare it with Peña Nieto's very weak numbers, I mean, this figure looks impressive. But if we put López Obrador approval numbers in context, the picture is quite different. He, at this stage, Felipe Calderón and Vicente Fox had more or less the same approval levels than López Obrador right now. So certainly the exception to this is obviously Peña Nieto and Ernesto Zedillo, that started his government with a severe economic crisis. But López Obrador's numbers in a comparative perspective, I mean, they are high, they are astonishing numbers, but we must not forget that in the past, presidents had the same level. So the key question is, what is different about López Obrador? And I think that one main difference between the popularity of López Obrador and Fox and Calderón is the intensity of approval. I mean, there are really a lot of strong López Obrador supporters. And in the past, with Calderón and Vicente Fox, we didn't have the cocktail effect of their popularity reflected in the incumbent parties' numbers. I mean, in the midterm elections of Fox and Calderón, they had pretty good numbers between 55 and 60%, but the PAN wasn't able to win the majority in the midterm elections. And I think that the difference with López Obrador is that the popularity of López Obrador at this stage really reflects in the strength of electoral support for Morena. I think this is a key difference going into the future. I mean, we are very far from the midterm elections, but at this stage, I mean, I'll show you later some numbers, but we can say more or less that 40% of the Mexican public is really a strong López Obrador supporter. This is not his highest number. It's been declining, but I think that's a key difference with the past. So that approval for López Obrador really has a very support, a base that really votes for Morena. That if you take into account that and the weakness of the position, that explains a lot of what is going on right now, because unlike the past, where the PRI had the majority either in one of the legislative chambers or a majority of the governorships, right now what we have is a president that has a majority, even though it is a plurality in the Senate, has a majority in the Senate and the House of Deputies. So what explains López Obrador's numbers? I would say that we sometimes commit the mistake of thinking that his approval levels are a reflection of what he's been doing, that his policies are either popular or those who are unpopular do not reflect in his approval levels. But if we go back a little bit further back, we can see that expectations are driving the approval levels of López Obrador. This is an index of retrospective evaluations of the economy. As you can see, hasn't changed that much. It improved a little bit the expectations of the economy, but retrospective evaluations of the economy right now, and this is based in INEGI's index of consumer confidence. I mean, people do not think that the current situation of the economy it's much better. Actually, they are thinking that 41% the economy is worse than 1 year ago, and only 14% think that it's better than 1 year ago, and these numbers are more or less similar to the ones that we had last November. But look what happens with expectations about the economy, either personal economy or the country's economy. They increase a lot after López Obrador victory. So in that regard, what we are witnessing right now is that behind López Obrador approval are expectations, but not reality or not it's not something that he has delivered to the public, but it's people that are expecting that he will deliver. And this is not something new for the López Obrador administration. You can look in the case of Calderón, for instance. Every time that there is an alternation in power, a change in government, expectations about the future of the country improve a lot. So, I mean, in comparison terms, you can see that this, the expectations are more or less similar to the ones that we had regarding Fox and Calderón. So in that sense, it's the same pattern. Just take a look at what happened with expectations once the sexenio develops. All the expectations begin to decline. It's very clear for all governments. So we should expect that the same thing is going to happen. And in that sense, we should expect also that López Obrador approval level will go down. This is just a correlation between approval levels and consumer confidence. It's an astonishing correlation because they are measuring more or less the same thing. I won't imply causality, but except with the case of Felipe Calderón, in general, INEGI's consumer confidence index moves more or less the same than approval levels, and I think because they are more or less measuring the same stuff, we do not know what they are measuring, but it's good to have an alternative measure to approval levels. These are approval levels for some policies. Sometimes they are he's got a lot of support or a lot of approval regarding the war on huachicoleo, I mean, the stealing of gasoline. Also, migration, I mean, surveys show that people are supporting his his tougher measures on migrants. So this is an issue that probably it has not been politicized at the moment or become partisan, but people are really thinking that it is good to have a tougher stance on migrants. It's quite contradictory, but the Mexican public is not very tolerant of migrants. The thing is that we haven't had that many in the past in Mexico, or has not become an issue. But I just want to stress this point. When we try to explain the approval levels of López Obrador, I mean, and to try to understand what has changed, I would say that to some extent his honeymoon is in part a consequence of the electoral campaign just being over. If you look at his approval numbers or the evaluation of the people, it increased a lot after the election on the side of independents, of panistas and priistas. So before the election, everybody was looking at López Obrador through a partisan lens. Once he wins the election, partisan bias is deactivated. So that explains why his approval levels jump a lot. But the key question here is that once we get closer to another election, it's probably that panistas and priistas will begin to look at him in a more critical way, and we should expect that as we get closer to the midterm elections, that will also influence down his approval levels. And just to finish, this is a segmentation of the Mexican public in terms of level of support for López Obrador. This is the latest one that we have about 1 month and a half. And as you can see, there is about 40% of the Mexican public, the one that it's in blue, that are really strong AMLO supporters. There are some weak AMLO supporters, and there is 26% of the Mexican public that is really against López Obrador. If you look at in comparison with the beginning of his term, numbers have shifted a lot. And especially after February, after the war on Huachicol, there was an increase in support for him, but this has declined. So currently we have 39% of strong AMLO supporters, 35 are weak AMLO supporters. I mean, that makes above 70%. It's a pretty good number, but it's not the same to be a strong AMLO supporter or a weak AMLO supporter, especially because of the correlation with support for Morena at the polling booth. But also we can see that right now the numbers are more or less similar to what we had before the inauguration of López Obrador. So to some extent, one part of the honeymoon is over, at least it seems that the inaugural trip is over. Approval levels are more or less similar to what we had in November. And probably what we are going to see is that till the end of the year, we will be looking at numbers that were more or less similar to the ones that he had before he won the election. So we should expect, and this has happened in other terms, that López Obrador approval levels will still go down and probably stabilize around October, November. And I will stop at here.
Perfect. Thank you so much,
you.
Jorge. That was excellent. Great way to get us started. Blanca, can I turn to you next to talk about the fourth transformation? Then we can dive more into some specific issue areas after that.
Well, thank you for the invitation to be here. It is a pleasure to be with the CIDE of the 90s also, and very close and dear colleagues. On July 1st, 2018, Andrés Manuel López Obrador was elected president of Mexico. That much is clear, and I am pretty sure we can all agree on that. Great. What started the following day, however, is still bereft of a common name. This matters because it makes straightforward analysis and assessment more complex. What political phenomenon has been playing itself out in Mexico since July 1st, 2018? Is it 5 months of transition plus 7 months of new presidential administration? Is it a peaceful revolution? Is it regime change? Or, as the president never tires of reminds us, it's the fourth transformation. When the meaning of words and the name of things is widely shared, concerning oneself with them might be fascinating, but it is dispensable. In contexts where the regular links among words, meanings, and empirical reference are thrown into disarray, however, the semantic becomes openly political, and the conditions for recent debate rapidly erode. An eloquent example of the unsettled semantic times we live in is the non-conversation between AMLO and his liberal critics about corruption. Both use the same term. Both see the thing as an unalloyed evil that needs to be extracted from the country's body politic as fast as possible. But coincidence stops right there. For the liberal opposition, corruption is conjugated in essentially legal terms. López Obrador, in contrast, understands corruption not as a legal problem, I repeat, not as a legal problem, but as a strictly moral one. Given that we're living in this peculiarly unsettled and unsettling semantical context, by the way, not only in Mexico, here and in many other parts of the world, very much so too, I want to use this space to call your attention to the value of minding words, premises and frames of references, and of making them explicit. What name we decide to give the political thing that unfolded in Mexico 1 year ago matters a lot, because it ends up defining what other instances of the thing we deem it comparable to. And also it defines what criteria and metrics we employ to assess it, and ultimately what decisions we take in relation to it, not to speak of which emotional buttons it presses us with. Treating the year running from July 2018 to June 2019 in Mexico as 5 months transition and 7 months new presidential administration is useful for assessing very important matters, and I'm sure my colleagues will do this today. I'll take a different lens. But first, let me illustrate the analytical value of shifting frames of reference, assumed to be obvious, only possible ones to appropriately apprehend a given social object. In his brilliant analysis of the Chinese economic miracle, Wang Hui, as you know, China's most important contemporary public intellectual, starts out by arguing that the most relevant and fertile frame of reference and comparison to answer this question is to place China's embrace of the market in the context of the disintegration of the Soviet Union and its satellite countries. Such frame is not the first one to come to mind, not to mine anyway. The obvious ones are, say, the fast-growing Northeast Asian economies, or India, or some abstract model of economic growth. But the collapse of communist countries? How could that possibly be relevant for answering the question of how China managed in 30 years to bring out of poverty 650 million human beings? Wang Hui's argument is subtle and very complex, but in a nutshell, to answer the question of what explains China's economic miracle, he first poses and addresses a different question. And that is, why didn't China collapse as communist countries? While the Soviet Union was disintegrating, China had Tiananmen. His answer, because the Chinese Revolution built a national state whose social basis was the vast majority of the Chinese people. That very strong state was able not only to retain political control despite dire economic conditions, but also to launch a process of economic modernization and to act in a relatively neutral sense in social terms. That is, not just defending, say, capital, but rather defending and supporting, at least initially, the overwhelming majority of the Chinese population, and thus promoting and allowing for a rapid, momentous, and inclusive process of economic modernization and growth unparalleled in human history. My frame of reference for reflecting upon politics and government since López Obrador won the presidential election last year is to use the larger category of comparable phenomenon, all of which have to do with the social, political, and cultural backlash against neoliberal globalization in numerous countries and regions around the world. And let me call it neoliberal globalization, but we could also call it modernization, Western style. This long-term process that started sometime in the end of the 18th century, and that has been very violent, including in the now developed North. We have conveniently edited all of the violence, but in fact it is a process of modernization of this country included that was not smooth and soft. This backlash comes in different formats and versions, just as the most recent backlash at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century also come in different formats. Communism and Nazism were not the same thing. Social democracy, certainly not. But they were all backlashes against the first globalization. This time around, what we have in these backlashes against neoliberal globalization are things like Islamic radicalism and its terrorist expressions, xenophobic nationalism, Modi's Hindu fundamentalism, Trump, Brexit, neo-Nazis in Germany and elsewhere, and of course, I would say AMLO and his fourth transformation. López Obrador's style and mode of exercising political power shares important features with all of these instances of anti-globalization. Among them, the personal centrality of the leader, the centrality of the discourse of the people against the villain. In some cases, it's elites, as in the Mexican case. In others, it's the other, those that are different from us. The centralization of political power, the disregard, if not outright weakening, of independent institutions and political counterweights, the lack of interest, really, disregard, and the lack of respect for the law. Now, the Mexican version of this populist backlash, however, has also some distinctive features. One of its most distinctive features, particularly in relation to the rest of the instances that are now present in the world, is that it's its clear orientation in favor of the have-nots without a clear external enemy or a clear other enemy. It's against the Mexican elites. Indications of it are the massive budgetary shift in favor of the poorer segments of the population, the raise in the minimum wage, and a very major labor reform, a president that speaks like them and speaks to them. Another particularity, as I mentioned briefly, but this is, I think, crucial, in contrast, for instance, with the pink La Ola Rosa of the previous populist wave in Latin America on the left, Mexican AMLO is not, in fact, shows an aversion to confrontation with the US. And finally, another not too common characteristic of these political regimes, a strong commitment to fiscal discipline and monetary stability. Understood as an idiosyncratic expression of the populist movements and regimes riding and fueling the anger and anxiety accumulated over 30 years of harrowing economic, social, and cultural dislocations produced by the drive for democracy and open markets in left-behind countries, marked by abysmal inequalities in wealth, income, livelihoods, and opportunities. AMLO's regime in the making provides a version that, though not necessarily pretty, might not be as ugly as many others. Most importantly, it, in my mind, is more, this thing is more akin to a regime change or a peaceful revolution than to a regular beginning of a new presidential administration. Having characterized AMLO's regime as one version of this anti-neoliberal backlash occurring in many parts of the world, I now want to very briefly provide a preliminary assessment of his first year in command in terms of what he promised and what he argues is his primary motivation and goal, namely to engineer a major institutional balance of social power, operative, everything being balance of social power, and cultural transformation in favor of the poor, the working classes, and the socially excluded, as well as of the basic rules that make it impossible for them to stop being so. Let me repeat. It's not in the positive, it's in the negative. He wants to dismantle the basic set of rules that make it impossible for these excluded sectors to stop being excluded. So it's a major transformation in the sense of one aimed at the root social causes and tight institutional knots, bottlenecks that perpetuate inequality, deprivation, and privilege. It is a strong and deeply uncomfortable transformation of the goals, priorities, and instruments of government in favor of all, but especially of the poor. A move, that is, towards goals and aspirations that are not the ones that we have grown accustomed to thinking as those everybody desires. I don't have time, but obviously the clearest expression of this symbolic condensation of the neoliberal dream going down the window is the Texcoco airport. A deep break understood finally as a new pair of eyeglasses to look at and organize our experience of the world, a new language to describe and interpret things, and critically important, a sense of moral compass to provide grounding and meaning to both individual and collective choice. Deploying such framework on the positives, hard realism and pragmatism in relation to macroeconomic stability, relationship with the United States, and use of force and coercion in trying to regain territorial control vis-a-vis organized and disorganized crime. Far-reaching change in the language, forms, and symbols associated with the exercise of political power. Clear, strong, and very swift, though not very well executed, shift in the government's attention in favor of the poor, marginalized, and excluded. Willingness to break out of the standard neoliberal recipe book and to engage in incredible amounts of policy experimentation. Decisiveness and speed. Dismantling and or budgetary asphyxiation of the intermediary units and structures, many of which siphoned fiscal resources for private gain, but most importantly, that made it impossible to have a functional relationship between social demand for government services and government services. Visible return of the matter of morality to the public space. Incredible after our moral complete bankruptcy during the last administration. But it's back. In sum, on the positive side, a widening limits of the possible, of the realm of the possible, and a return of the inadmissible. On the negatives, weakness, if not absence, of a project, of a program for the desirable future, as well as of a plan for getting there. Notice here the telling selection on his own part of fourth transformation of the name of AMLO's project. Emphasis on the transformation, not on the destination. A strong resistance against institutional limits, formal rules, independent centers of power, and different and opposing points of view, in some authoritarian tendencies. 3, inattention to the importance of strong bureaucratic and professional governmental capabilities. Complete disregard in this particular regard, very similar to Mr. Mao. 4, disregard, if not full disdain or ressentiment for technical and expert knowledge. Large costs, material and symbolic, imposed, I would say, a bit unnecessarily and very bad idea on the middle classes, which could end up feeding the type of anxiety and resentment you in this country know very well, and that offers the perfect breeding soup for the extreme right. And 6, an emphasis, at least so far, on destroying institutions and arrangements regarded as central obstacles standing in the way of social, economic, and cultural order conducive to social inclusion. In sum, on the liabilities column, more emphasis on destruction of existing arrangements than attention to construction of new ones, and strong propensity to disregard and or disqualify opposing centers of power, legal limits, and expert knowledge. Closing up, after many months of almost obsessively trying to understand on my part what López Obrador is, represents, thinks, wants, and means, I see his young self, borrowing Pankaj Mishra's brilliant wording and image, as an alienated young man of promise, in a very long line of similar wants. Mao, Ataturk, Perón, Stalin, Mussolini. Ones that felt shunned and excluded from societies that scorned them, and that produced and that underwent social havoc in the tales of the promise for individual freedom and opportunity in places marked by enormous differences in wealth, status, income, and education. Today, I see him as a man endowed with enormous power, based on votes, yes, but also on the support of millions of Mexicans, long excluded, exploited, and edited away. As a president, yes, but also as a political leader, riding and steering, so far steering, the anger, resentment, and hopes of millions. In terms of the type of political phenomenon his electoral victory and his accession to presidential power has unleashed, I see a populist regime in the making, situated in the left side of the political spectrum, which makes it quite unique in the world today. That combination, anti-globalization, backlash that's on the left. I can only think of AMLO, in fact. In my balance of what has happened so far in relation to what he promised, on the positives, in some very clear widening of the limits of the possible and return of the inadmissible, on the negatives, much more attention to destruction than to construction, and complete disregard for institutional legal limits and expert knowledge. All in all, summing it all up, what I see in these last 12 months is an opportunity. An opportunity I know I will not see again in my lifetime. An opportunity to break away from the shackles of perpetually stalled and deformed development that concentrates all of the goodies in a minuscule few. An opportunity, no more, but no less. No certainty that it will in fact translate into more possibilitating future. Most probably, a lot of continued destruction, most probably for the full 6 years, and little economic growth. But hopefully, continued macroeconomic stability, no further deterioration of the security mayhem, and ideally some modest gains in that terrain. But let us hope that that opportunity that will most probably be very destructive in the next few years does in fact provide the setting for building a more just country. Finishing. We are living, not only in Mexico, peculiarly anxious and angry times. Vast swaths of people in numerous countries around the world are saying, enough of your global modernization drive. We want protection from fear and extreme uncertainty. We want to know we can put food on the table every day. We want to be seen. We want to be heard. Some are saying it in electoral booths, others by blowing themselves up, others still by fleeing their countries of birth and risking it all in journeys of hell. For elites, understandably, these are also jarring and very uncomfortable times. These political arrangements and legitimation structures that help sustain the latest and broadest ever drive for Western-style progress and modernization are becoming undone. Elites are resisting, obviously, and will continue to do so. No emperor likes it when his clothes fade or disappear. Our version of this backlash powered by the forgotten many is an opportunity. I hope we may not waste it.
Thank you very much, Blanca. Maria Amparo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christopher, and thank you all of you for being here. Nice participating again here and with these panelists. Blanca's piece is very provocative. I know Blanca well enough, and for many years, not to believe that she wouldn't like Mao way or an authoritarian regime, but also I know her well enough to know that she wants to see a more successful country, more successful, or by successful meaning more opportunities, more egalitarianism, more peaceful, more homogeneous society, more competitive, and the rest. Yes, but means matter, I believe. So, indeed, as Jorge has shown, Andrés Manuel López Obrador has a high level of support, not very different from Fox and Calderón, however, much more intense. Yes, unfortunately, I do believe that support does not have as one of its collateral effects or secondary, collateral effects, neither sound economic or social policies, nor the strengthening of democracy. It often brings undesired consequences and spillover or side effects which may be difficult to reverse in some time, okay? How much progress is the question of this seminar, or it's a question posed by this seminar, and that depends on what we understand by progress. Progress can be measured by what the president promised in his inaugural address, by his campaign political manifesto, or by other more standard measures. But let's take the first one, what he promised and what apparently he's aiming at. AMLO has stated in his last discourse that he has already met 78 of his 100 promises, and that safe security and health, where he recognizes more difficulties than he had originally or initially judged, he will deliver a peaceful country and a health system, quote unquote, comparable to those of Scandinavian countries. If we take this as a guideline, the 100 promises he made, I think we should divide them into those which do not require much effort and time or money, like leaving the presidential residence and opening it to the public, decreeing the presidential salary, selling the governmental air fleet and flying in commercial airlines, reduction of personal staff to high-rank officials, and disappearance of privileges such as private health insurance to all public servants, or even disappearing the presidential guard. And that's one set of measures. And those that take a much longer, careful decision-making, and especially a longer maturing process, like universal health, ending corruption and impunity, making Pemex a productive public company, attaining food and energy self-sufficiency, reduction of violence, or high growth rates. In these last measures, he has very little to show. The former he has delivered, but in no meaningful sense can we say that he has something to show regarding the three issues highlighted since his campaign: insecurity, inequality, and corruption. Nonetheless, I do believe that it would be inappropriate to pass judgment on the new administration by the results thus far. I wouldn't expect insecurity indexes to fall. Yes, I wouldn't expect the Mexican economy to be growing after 7 months of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or corruption to disappear, although he claims that corruption has altogether disappeared. In spite of the apparent blitzkrieg that we have witnessed in the first 7 months, or in the first year since he won the election, I believe honestly that it is too soon to judge results by either growth, investment, inequality, insecurity, perception of corruption, or whatever. Thus, the question is not whether Mexico is any better than it was 7 months ago, but if there are reasons to think that it will be better anytime soon, or even in the medium term, given his policies. In this sense, I'd like to claim that it is not too soon to judge trends, and that is what I'm going to do, judge trends, and use process parameters to appraise where this government is going. And here are my substantial, and I hope, substantiated worries. So the first question is whether López Obrador's administration is heading in the direction in order to attain his proclaimed goals, whether the policies he's announcing as he's following are prone to produce the expected results. And I couldn't agree more with López Obrador that he received a country in ruins regarding his three axes of policy making: violence, inequality, and corruption, and that growth has been all but disappointing in what he calls the 30 years or so of neoliberal rule. Yet his policies do not seem to have the potential to produce anything better than we have seen in the last 30 years. Regarding security, there is a consensus. I'm not a specialist. I've read a lot, but I'm not a specialist, but there is a consensus among them that there is no strategy that differs from what other presidents have attempted, particularly what has been called Calderón's war against crime. True, unlike Calderón, who failed to create a national police because he couldn't get the opposition and governors to agree, he has set the National Guard, but as previous administrations, there are no signs of an integrated strategy that includes prevention, a system to denounce crimes, protection of the population against common and organized crime, nor a criminal policy, believe it or not, that includes a coordination of investigative police, sufficient and well-prepared prosecutors, and a fairly efficient administration of justice. In the field of inequality, the second field he wants to face, he has launched a huge set of programs that are bent on giving cash to the poorest, but to my knowledge, assistantialism has never taken a country out of poverty or improved opportunities for the population. Again, I stand with López Obrador in the idea of making certain rights universal, but for them to be sustainable, you need much more than handing out money, which, by the way, is associated with neoliberal policies. The voucherization of the or the social policy. Social policy is not the summing up of a handful of programs that certainly alleviate a very impoverished and needy society. Social policy, to my knowledge, is a set of guidelines, of principles, legislation, and activities that affect conditions conducive to human welfare. And that is not what we are witnessing. What we are witnessing is the creation of literally millions of citizens receiving not better social services, nor making good the promises of all the rights Mexicans are entitled to by Constitution, but simply resources to alleviate, as I was saying, a very impoverished society. Along this comes the attainment of a very wide, grateful political base, which can have big political returns. In my calculation, taking into account only the 7 most publicized social programs, 23 million people will be receiving direct resources from this from government by the end of 2020. This amounts to 26% of the voters in 2021. Intermediate elections. However, if we take as a starting point the voting rate for intermediate elections, they amount to 52% of the projected votes. I believe this is pure clientelism. Okay, so it has political gains, but not economic or social gains, not even for the people to whom these programs are directed. Finally, corruption and one other thing regarding social programs. He has, in fact, and I believe it is a very good thing, a lot of intermediaries for giving out these social programs. However, he has become the sole intermediary, for all these resources. So everyone knows, or everyone believes, that it is Andrés Manuel López Obrador, not even Morena, but Andrés Manuel López Obrador, that is handing out this very welcome the help. Finally, corruption and impunity. Aside from saying that the new president is honest, that he will not stand for corruption, that corruption is forbidden, and that people have good hearts, and if authorities set the example, they will not incur in corrupt behavior. Yes, anti-corruption and anti-impunity measures have been either absent or disappointing. Blanca is right. He does not treat corruption as a legal matter, not even as a matter of incentives, yeah, but as a moral problem. And well, he claims that if we change morality, we will change also this corruption, this systemic corruption in the Mexican society, in Mexican businessmen, and in the Mexican public sector. It is not only that, to the surprise of many, he has proposed not to prosecute the past corruption crimes, or that he has repeatedly said that corruption needs little more than political will to be banned, but that practically the only measure he has adopted in transforming corruption actions into is to transform corruption actions into grave, how do you say, graves?
Very serious.
Grave crimes, high felony crimes, basically.
Felony crimes, yeah, that is, felony crimes, that by law will not have the benefit of going through trial in liberty. Just imagine what that can mean in Mexico, yes, that you can be put into jail just because they point at you to have committed an alleged corruption act. No? Also, I must mention that for a president that has corruption and impunity as a high priority, I really cannot understand the budget reductions in precisely those agencies that have to deal with these matters. 11% reduction to the judiciary, a 5.5% to the Attorney General Office, a general office that has to be built from scratch, a 16% to the Financial Unity Office, a 14% to the Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. In fact, the Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office has 12 people, all in all, including the head of it and the driver of the new prosecutor. Okay, and 24% to the Governmental Internal Affairs Secretary. Yeah. So I really don't know. I do believe that resources in Mexico have been used in a very bad way, yeah, and that there is a lot of room to reduce budget, but why especially in this? And all of this has not gone to social programs or to social budget. Social budget grew by 9% regarding last year. The second question I referred to at the beginning is whether AMLO, whether López Obrador is conducting himself within the most basic democratic parameters in the exercise of power. And here the trends are not encouraging. Electoral legitimacy, high popularity, and a majority in Congress do not mean a blank check to the president. There are contradictory signals, to say the least, regarding the rule of law. Blanca mentioned it. On the one side, one of his favorite sayings is that nothing and no one above the law. But on the other side, he says, if you have to choose between justice and the law, do not hesitate. Choose justice. That means in a country like Mexico, yes, that he is pushing the citizenry to do justice by its own hand and to justify justice by your own hand. That was very characteristic of Andrés Manuel López Obrador when he was mayor of Mexico City. It is becoming characteristic of this administration, and I believe it has perverse incentives in the sense that if I do not believe, and I don't believe that taxes in Mexico are fair, yes, I really don't understand why I have to pay the same as, say, Mr. Slim or Mr. Azcárraga or Mr. Salinas or whoever. Yes, I pay the same rate. And I don't know how many less I earn than they do. But that does not give me the right, yes, to pay less. I have to pay my 35% rate, yes. But if he allows me, if the president says it's okay to do that, well, then let's do it. The breach of law may be, or for me, the most essential component of democracy is becoming troublesome. In a recent piece of research, I registered at least 20 actions which can be deemed openly illegal and another 7 of contested legality. or illegality. They range from the widely criticized memorandum where the president commands 3 of his secretaries to cancel all measures resulting from the education reform approved in the previous administration, by the previous legislature, to refraining from of making good all the regulations that derived from that reform. Yes. Another one, refraining, for example, from freeing the trail tracks blocked by one of the teachers' unions during 27 days by saying that his is not a repressive government, yes, but affecting the economy in many, many, many thousands of millions of dollars, or from conducting a census with party members and launching a mock popular consultation for projects outside the constitutional procedure. We have a constitutional procedure for popular consultation, but he makes his popular consultations to his liking. Other measures are like vetoing 3 pharmaceutical companies. Maybe they are corrupt, yes, but we have an institution that decides whether they hold monopoly power or not. Yes, well, he vetoed 3 pharmaceutical companies from competing in a governmental bidding. My count is 20 of these type of measures, plus another 7 since the 31st of May. Many executive orders and past legislation have been brought to the highest courts under the argument that they are unconstitutional, violate fundamental rights, or imply the invasion of authority granted to other branches of powers or subnational levels of government. To my knowledge, and I've been doing the counting, in the last 4 governments, no other one but López Obrador's has so many lawsuits in the courts. As of today, there are 7 lawsuits for unconstitutionality, 34 constitutional controversies, and literally thousands of individual appeals against different executive decisions. Some claim, however, that to produce a grand transformation, Blanca also already mentioned it, the law has to be bent or even disregarded. I do not agree. If we don't like the laws, if we believe they are unjust, AMLO has the best opportunity to change these laws because he has both a simple and constitutional majority in the lower chamber and a simple majority in the Senate. But it is not only the alleged shift away from the rule of law that concerns some of us. It is also the process of concentration and centralization of power underway, the increasing decree powers in budgetary matters in the recent Republican austerity law approved by the Senate last week. There is a transitory article that mandates the amendment of the budget and spending responsibility law to expand the already wide discretionary spending powers of the executive. And it says, literally, I'm quoting, that all the savings can be used by, in whatever, to whatever is the objective the president wants just by decree. It is also the contempt of the rulings of the ombudsman in Mexico, the attempt to capture or weaken the autonomous agencies, either through inadequate designations, budget reductions, or public scorning, the violation of the principle of presumption of innocence, the erosion of open data that we're witnessing, the constant disqualification on moral grounds of what he calls his adversaries and enemies of change, or the disdain of knowledge, experts, and best policy practices. All of these because they are deemed obstacles to the will of the president and the wisdom of the people. Finally, there is a growing personalization of power in the presidential figure that have adverse consequences on the daily work of the public administration and that customize or brand all social programs and decisions. Nobody claims that institutions in Mexico were sufficiently strong or that they were not in need of reform. And nobody claims that all the above-mentioned practices were absent in previous administrations. However, the man that claims that is performing the fourth transformation is using all those practices of the last 36 years. And instead of strengthening or redressing, restructuring these institutions and these practices, the tendency has been to weakening or putting them aside. So no, I am not nostalgic about past times, and I am aware of the chronic capitalism that prevails in Mexico, and I'm fully aware of the malfunctioning of our institutions. What I want to argue is that the trends we are seeing do not constitute progress, nor correspond to a promised transformation or to what López Obrador himself calls a true democracy. In sum, trends more than results are not promising or reassuring. And returning to the question of the seminar, I would conclude that no, that most of López Obrador's policies, together with the team he has chosen to further them, are ill-equipped to attain the desired results. It is a pity that his policies don't seem the right ones to transform the country. For the first time in 21 years, he has all the instruments and all the power to get all these things done. No other president has had the Congress on his side. No other president has been able to do all these designations. No other president has had the legitimacy López Obrador has. But, and here I do not agree with Blanca, I do not believe that he seeks modernization, but regression in very many senses to what we had in the 60s. And I want to end with this. Yeah, apparently we have a president from the left, but we have a leftist president without policies associated with the left. Lowering wages, reducing salaries, no taxation to the rich, reducing the state, handing out cash, and he does not even hold the social agenda in terms of egalitarian marriages or pro-choice. He furthers financial stability. I mean, I agree with all of these things, but he's not a leftist government in the terms that up to now we think policies that should be furthered by the left. And we have, and I will talk about it when we come to the questions, and we have also diminishing returns or worries on the coming electoral front, not only because of the laws that he's promoting, but also because we don't have the first ingredient after the rule of law to have a working democracy, which is opposition in Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Antonio, it's all yours.
Yes, thank you, Chris, and also great to be here with dear friends and colleagues. And they provided a very sort of a deep and thoughtful framework. What I'll do is get a bit more down into the weeds in terms of what I was asked to do. I was asked to share my thoughts on the prospects for the Mexican economy 1 year after AMLO's victory. I will do them in a bit of a telegraphic manner, and I'll be glad to get into the details in the Q&A section. The first thing one could do when looking for prospects is to look at the estimates, And given that Christine Lagarde's been in the news, she will be the new head of the ECB. She visited President López Obrador. I decided to take the IMF estimates. late last year, the estimate was for 2.3% growth for this year. And in April of this year, the IMF downgraded that to 1.6% for this year. There are many lower estimates by other institutions, around 1%, some even lower than 1%. To give you some perspective, the growth for the Peña Nieto sexenio was about 2.4%, and growth the first year was about 1.4%. So if the current trends prevail, the growth during the López Obrador sexenio will be 2.3%, which is exactly the same than the Peña Nieto growth. And I think that's a problem, because the basic aim of the López Obrador administration is to have stability with growth. Under previous governments, we had stability and very low growth, and the problem is that per capita growth has been flat for decades. And I think that is just, ethically wrong. It's unnecessary and it's unsustainable. That is the problem, per capita GDP growth. I do think it is possible for the Mexican economy to grow by 4% at the end of the sexenio, but some things would need to change. Saying that, let me turn briefly to monetary policy. I do not have concerns about monetary policy during the current López Obrador administration. The Banco de México, the central bank, is independent. It will remain independent. And as some of my colleagues have intimated, this is in many senses a conservative government. So from a monetary policy perspective, and especially inflation perspective, the government is conservative. And it likes to say that inflation is low. One thing to look out for is that only 2 of the current 5 members are guaranteed to remain in their post until the end of the sexenio. So a majority will have a changeover from now until the end of the sexenio. Will the changeover in members of the Board of Governors imply change in policy? I don't know, but that's not where I lose some sleep. I really, to be frank, I'm not concerned. Let me now turn to fiscal policy. Again, this is a conservative government. I am not concerned about irresponsible fiscal spending in terms of the amount of spending. My concern is where money is spent and where the budget is cut. I'm not looking at, at the budget deficit just in terms of there's no big deficit, we're fine. I'm not sure that's the right way to assess things. I do believe that there was a lot of corruption. I think there's still a lot of corruption and inefficiency, and that some cuts were necessary. I think that some of them were perhaps not too wise, especially the weakening of the state. The government has very ambitious economic plans, and it needs a strong and capable and independent state. It needs strong and capable and independent regulatory institutions in energy, in telecom, and other areas. Otherwise, it will be difficult to implement these reforms. And I think that the budget cuts have weakened the federal government, have weakened independent regulatory institutions, and it will make it very difficult for the government to fulfill its aims. In the middle to the longer term, I am a bit concerned about fiscal policy, because the president has said that he would not increase taxes and he would not increase the debt in relative terms. So if GDP is low, then the absolute amount of money that will be available is low. What will happen then? I don't know. Will the government recur to international loans or be not as careful with this fiscal stance? I don't know, but I think there's a problem brewing in the medium to longer term. Thirdly, let me share my views on how Mexico is perceived by foreign investors. And, I have been in this business for incredible amount, now that I think of it, I don't have a lot of hair now, 29 years. So I do think I have a perspective about how foreign investors look at Mexico. And I would say that they are less concerned about many things that people in Mexico think they should be concerned about. They don't follow the mañaneras, or as Foreign Secretary Barrett called them here, the morningueras. They're not concerned about prensa fifí or reforma or the Twitter sphere. It's a lot of noise. They focus on a lot of countries. I mean, they're really not too concerned about that, okay? But they are concerned about some things. The cancellation of the construction of the New Mexico City Airport did create a lot of concerns, not because of the cancellation per se, but because of the way it was canceled. Maria Amparo mentioned an ad hoc consultation that was not done according to Mexican law, and we have laws that provide for consultations. So it was not the cancellation per se, but the way it was canceled and the changing reasons for the cancellation. There was corruption, it's too luxurious, it's not the best option, it's too expensive. That's what created a problem. And I would say that the second most contentious issue since then is the recent conflict between Federal Electricity Commission and a number of national and international energy companies. I was the head of economic affairs at the Mexican Embassy for about 9 years, and one thing that I remember very well was in February 2013, and I'm talking about the Peña Nieto administration, a legislator from the PRI was about to introduce an amendment to modify the concession for Mexican railroads. And under that amendment, the idea was to change the rules under which the concession could be revoked. It could be for tax issues, or if the railroad operators were not offering rates that the government wanted. And believe me, I got a number of calls, and they were not very friendly calls, and they said, you just implemented a series of reforms on telecoms, infrastructure, energy, etc. Mexico will not receive investment if they keep changing the rules. Again, this is the Peña Nieto administration, and I think that the cancellation of the New Mexico City Airport and the contentious situation between these energy companies and CFE are along the same lines of what happened. And why are these foreign investors concerned? Not because there could be an arbitration. It is normal to have disputes. All free trade agreements have dispute settlement mechanisms. It is normal to go to arbitration. That's why contracts have arbitration clauses. What is not normal is to use an arbitration clause to try to renegotiate contract. It's not to clarify, a difference in interpretation. It's that, I know what the contract says. I don't like the terms of the contract, and I will renegotiate the contract. And not only that, but there's a pipeline that has been finished, and CFE is not, decreeing that it is ready to operate it, and therefore paying operator, right, as a way to exert leverage in the negotiations. And that means that manufacturers are not receiving very badly gas that they need. And I'm sure that, gas exporters from the U.S. and Canadian investors are not terribly happy. Again, it is normal to have disputes. It is normal to have disagreements. But the nature of the disagreement and the stance taken by some in the government is what is creating a lot of concern. And I'm sure that Canadian companies are concerned. I mean, I don't think it's easy to upset the Canadians, but the Canadian ambassador to Mexico was, very upset about this, and he was talking about, the need to establish predictability and stability and rules and to respect contract. And Mexico will soon have a new agreement with the EU and with EFTA, and Mexico is trying to diversify, and I think very smartly, its foreign economic relations, export destination, origin, FDI, etc. And Europeans will be looking at this, and the members of the CPTPP agreement will be looking at this, including Canada. So I think that it is troubling to see this. The good news is that there are negotiations ongoing, and hopefully arbitration will be avoided and a decision will be reached. But this is the sort of thing I think that the government cannot really afford if it really wants to attract vast amounts of investment to increase growth rates. Very briefly on the USMCA, and then some concluding comments. I do believe the USMCA will ultimately be ratified. When? I have no idea, and I don't think Chris does either. We talk a lot about these issues. And the aim behind USMCA and the reason why Canada and the US wants it, and the reason why the López Obrador administration wants it, even though it's ditching neoliberalism, is because it provides certainty. And Mexico is very much relying on its trade and investment relations with its North American partners, especially with the US. But the US is now a source of uncertainty, not certainty. It is a very different world from when we negotiated NAFTA, right? Or when Obama was president, and there's uncertainty in Europe, and we have Brexit. So the global political economy is in flux. I agree with Blanca. I think that this is whole-scale change. I don't think this is a small crisis. I think these are tectonic plates moving, and we won't go back to the old ways of doing things. So one way to create certainty among an ocean of uncertainty that will remain uncertain for a number of years is through the USMCA. Now, I think that the Mexican government has a big opportunity to create certainty within this environment of uncertainty. I would say that the USMCA will not be enough to generate certainty. And I think at the end of the day, international businesses are not so much concerned as the rules per se or terms of contract per se, as the fact that the rules be respected, procedures be respected, as Maria Amparo said, and that there are no surprises. For example, I'm pretty sure that given the strong concentration of power that López Obrador has, he could get really good deals from foreign investors if there is a credibility that he would stick with the deal no matter what. And this would make Mexico very attractive to foreign investment because it needs to grow at high rates. It needs to attract investment, and other areas are not growing at high rates at all. And if he, exacts some interesting concessions from foreign investors, I think that they would be willing to play ball. Again, as he says, I will respect the terms, and there are no surprises. So there's still time to have stability and growth, but I do think that the government needs to really make sure that there's stability, credibility, predictability in terms of the way it engages with domestic investors and with foreign investors. I'll leave it at that, and hopefully we can get a bit more into the weeds during the Q&A, Chris.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Antonio. As you all see, there's this CIDE connection among these panelists, but very different perspectives on the issues at hand. Most importantly, on what terms we should be judging even this new administration. I mean, that's a fundamental question. Should we be judging the administration and understanding issues of public opinion and popularity as in line with previous administrations? Can we say that trends from the past will hold true in the present? Or is this a true regime change and a great tectonic shift in Mexico, and should it be judged on different terms outside of the frameworks that we've traditionally referenced? Should we judge it based on GDP per capita as a clear measure of where things are going, on the ability of the administration to reach its stated goals in terms of anti-corruption, inequality, and violence and security? Those are massive questions. We have basically run out of time. We did start a little bit late, so let's make sure we do get to the audience. But I think what we are going to do is just have to take a few questions from the audience and then come back one time each to the panelists to address whichever pieces of that they can. And we'll have to do it all in sort of lightning format in a brief round in order to respect people's time. So I'm going to I had a billion questions, but I'm going to just sort of pose one of my own to throw out there as a piece of the conversation, and you all can get to that, and as well as the questions from the audience. But I mean, it does seem to me that transformation, if that's the goal, is sort of this deeper type of transformation, does require popular support, continued popular support in democracy. And I think there's just a huge question as to whether or not, given everything that each of you have stated, it's possible to maintain a level of popular support to continue with a process of transformation, given the challenges that you brought up, Blanca, in terms of focusing on professional public administration, the ability to deliver on things based on the quality of people in place and sort of allowing professionals to do their job at a more minute level. But also based on just the economic environment, the global economic environment, along with the economic environment locally within Mexico put forward by the policies of the administration. And then the other piece of this, though, is there an opposition that can capitalize in terms of popularity if the president and the administration fails to deliver on some of these important areas? And, the state of the PAN and the PRI right now is very much in disarray. So I have big questions about the sustainability of popularity of this administration, but also big questions on the ability of any other party to capitalize on that loss of popularity. So I wonder if you all can sort of think about the ability to continue based on that type of a framework. And let me now open it up to some of you to take some of your questions as well. Please just identify yourself and then be concise in your question. Thank you.
Adam Murillo, an American University. My question is, what is the AMLO that we are observing? On the one side, Blanca, you mentioned that he is looking for the excluded people, but on the other hand, we saw that he eliminated Progresa. You said that he is trying to finally put in his place the elites, but he make a council with entrepreneurs. You said that he is promoting finally the end of the neoliberalism in Mexico, but he observed that he is just maintaining the public health of the finance. Recently, he defended trade. These are two important parts of the neoliberalism. So I'm not clear what is the AMLO that we are watching, and if these policies really will help to end the poverty in Mexico. That is one of the things, as he said, for the best of everybody, first the poor. I would love to know that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there another question the audience would like to take? Yeah, we have one more up here.
Howard Woldridge from Citizens Opposing Prohibition. Be a question, I guess, for Blanca. When you talk about ending corruption in Mexico, the cartels are still bringing back about $40 billion across the border. Isn't it more of a pipe dream to think about ending corruption in Mexico when you've got the corrosive influence of the cartels?
Thanks for the question. And one final question here in the back. Right there, it's Jesus.
I would like to know, I'm
Identify
Jesus
yourself.
Munoz from doing some research in Georgetown University about migration in Mexico. I would like to know what are the innovations in your views about migration in the mind of López Obrador, AMLO. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Okay, so we have a different range of questions. You all can jump into the ones that you sort of see most fit for yourselves, and we'll go back down the line. So Jorge, why don't you start?
Well, regarding if there is going to be enough support for AMLO's reforms, I think that without economic growth, and I agree with Antonio that if we don't have GDP growth, it's going to be very difficult for López Obrador to sustain a healthy approval level. Also, insecurity, it's really bad, and it doesn't seem that it's going to change. So I don't think that we have the fundamentals. I mean, the fundamentals are not right for López Obrador to sustain a high level of approval. And insofar as that doesn't happen, we should expect that people begin to be alienated towards his government. Although a key difference here is that, as I mentioned in the presentation, he's going to have a very strong base of support. His loyals, people that have been following him from like 15, 18 years. So we should expect that his bottom line should be about 30-35% of a strong support from the Mexican people, and then you will have probably 10-15% of the Mexican population that will still support him even in bad times. But 50% of approval level It's nothing exceptional in the Mexican experience. But, and here is the big if, with 35–40% of electoral support, Morena will win most of the important elections in Mexico. And I think this is the key difference with the past. AMLO's approval levels are nothing exceptional. Support for Morena is not exceptional, but the opposition has never been this weak. In the past, during the Calderón or Fox governments or even Peña Nietos, you had an opposition that was alive and kicking. And just to give you an example, this is the first time that the mayor of Mexico City belongs to the party of the president. And that means that in terms of opposition, there's no one that is going to criticize from the Mexico City's major office. No one is going to criticize the president. That was the role, that was the platform that put López Obrador into the spotlight, that he was the main opposition towards Vicente Fox, and then Marcelo Ebrard also became a very important figure. Likewise, governors in the past or states were in the hands of the opposition, mostly the PRI governors, which actually were highly popular. So that they were a real opposition to the party of the president. And just think about Enrique Peña Nieto since 2004, and by 2006-07, it was already a popular figure that was a counterweight to the Calderón government. There's no one like that kind of persons right now. So I think that the weakness of the position is that on the one hand, it's really fragmented, and on the other is completely discredited. I think that the PAN is the only one with a slight chance of capitalizing on opposition to López Obrador, but after the past presidential elections, the positioning of the PAN is very weak. So in the past, the position of opposition parties was really strong, and that's a complete difference with what was going on right now.
Thanks very much. I have one question actually also that came in via text from Duncan Wood, the director of the Mexico Institute, who's on the webcast watching, as are many others.
Duncan, because we're not here.
So I'll throw it into the mix here. Why not? He mentioned that we've brought up a little bit about the dispute between TransCanada and Nova and the government. But this question is just more generally about the weaknesses in the electric grid. I read an article this morning about shortages of natural gas becoming an issue in Mexico. There clearly are some weaknesses in the electric grid. How much of a factor will that prove to be as a potential weak point for the administration going forward? But let's continue down the line. So we're responding to all of the questions. So Blanca, you're up next, and thank you.
Okay, I want to address, was it Abraham? Is it Abraham? Yeah. Abraham. Thank you very much. Yes, you say that I argue, well, mostly he argues, but I also agree that he's focusing very much in shifting attention and resources towards the poorest and most excluded, socially excluded segments of the population. You say, if that is so, why does he end Prospera? Prospera is a program that's probably one of the most evaluated programs in the world. And I think all of the evaluations show that it was able to, at best,
just for those who do not know, what is Prospera, very quickly?
The first conditional cash transfer programs for alleviating poverty. And it was developed by a Mexican economist, well, a group, but mostly one Mexican economist, and it became the blueprint for all such programs in the world. And it proved effective in some, we could say, in terms of keeping poverty at 50%. It's difficult to have a counterfactual. If you did not have Progresa, most probably you would have had more poverty, but how much more? I don't know exactly. What is true is that it failed so far in terms of its stated central objective, which was explicitly to break the intergenerational transmission of poverty, and that it did not achieve. Perhaps it was too much of a high order That is something that you cannot leave to a single program. It's not important how great a program it was, as we all know, one of the things that happened even after it was extended to cover for upper secondary education, so that it ends, say, at around 18 years of age. The huge problem is you were able to get a bit better, perhaps medical attention to keep them in school, but then at the end of school, of what used to be compulsory schooling, upper secondary, high school, you get out and there's no jobs. And it's like the Mount Everest and you have no equipment, right? It's like really very difficult to break. So yes, you could say it did its job, kind of, what it could do, but it wasn't successful in its main objective. And at most, I think one could say that it managed to keep poverty at very high levels. So there was also room for rethinking. And one of the things that certainly one can say is that the implementation of this destruction and substitution, essentially with scholarships, has been less than well done. Around, what I've heard is around 25%, at present 25% of people and families covered by Prospera in the transition have suffered. The idea is that they will not continue to suffer, that they will be minded, but it has taken a few months to do so. As to why, if he wants to focus on the poor people and the socially excluded, he has a business council. I would say, more generally, he really hasn't touched the real economic elites very much. I would argue because of the huge structural power of Mexican business, which are highly transnational. At this point, it's very different from the kind of business elites that we had in the 1980s, that were very inward-looking, that most of their assets were in Mexico. Today, the largest firms, that's about 20% of GDP and about 20% of employment, are highly internationalized firms and very liquid financially. So it's very difficult, really, to imagine that you can have growth if you were to declare war upon them, and you would lose, like in 2 days. And then you also need to have at least some of them in your side. And we don't have time, but I think it's interesting politically what he did, because he, in fact, the main entrepreneurs that he put into his business council are the ones that have traditionally been scorned. They are also alienated young men of promise that were scorned by the Consejo Mexicano de Hombres, the Consejo Mexicano de Negocios, the real kind of elite.
Interesting. Thank you. Maria Amparo, and I hope you can help us answer the question as to whether or not the flow of cash from drug trafficking organizations means that there will always be corruption in Mexico regardless of what's done domestically.
No, I couldn't give you a technical explanation for that. I'm sorry. I mean, corruption is not only within organized crime or the dealings between local authorities and organized crime, but it is, as I was saying, a systemic, feature of the Mexican political system and of the dealings between the businessmen and the government. So I'm sorry, I'm not prepared to do that. Do I have a couple of minutes to say? There's one thing I just want to tell you, because yesterday we were talking about this we had this very heated, though friendly discussion yesterday night. And we were talking about the middle class, and we didn't talk about it today.
I did mention it briefly, but it's
briefly. And the middle class, we agreed yesterday that has been the sector that has most suffered in Mexico, and they're not very happy for that. And the poor are still not receiving, or at least not fully receiving, the benefits. So or Andrés Manuel is in a very difficult moment. The other thing I wanted to say is that Blanca mentioned that we should change our view, and try to look at López Obrador not from a traditional perspective, but from a new one, Yes, and I agree with you with that, and you were mentioning also that he doesn't care about the law. Yes, and it is, yeah, I mean, it's a moral thing, not a law thing. But if he doesn't care about laws, why is he the president that has sent, together with his party, more bills or initiative in his first first half year in
We're
in
gonna
the-
need another seminar. on
Yes,
this
please
matter.
invite us.
Round two.
And finally, because nobody addressed the question directly to me, there's no way of assessing social programs yet. We know about Progresa. We don't know what will happen with this giving away money to apparently 3 million guys or lads that do not
It's
receive.
an on-the-job training.
It is not on the, well,
It's on-the-job training.
it's supposed to be on the job training.
that's what
It
it
is
says, yeah.
supposed to be on the job training, but what I want to claim is that it is going to be very difficult to assess it because we don't have information. Yes, and I can prove this. I'll mention something to you. The web page of the Secretaría del Trabajo,
Called Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro.
yeah, that's the name.
the
One
name
of
of
the
the
signature
program.
social programs of the AMLO administration.
That's one of the pet projects of this guy. They give 3,600 per month to each youth, pesos. And that's how many dollars?
Divide by 20.
Well, divide by 20. To around 3 million people. Yes, by the end of the 2.3 million people. Okay. I take a screenshot every day of the Secretaría del Trabajo and the padrón, the census of people, and it changes constantly. It goes forward and backward and forward and backward. We have had a retroceso. We had
Retrospectives?
no retroceder.
No.
Regression.
We've lost the regression, yeah.
We've had a regression in terms of open data, as I was saying. And there are, for example, the last time I checked, 67,000 firms that were listed in the census, yes, that receive these kids or these guys or these students or these youth.
They're
These young people or study.
nor study.
Okay.
Between
So-
18 and 19 years of age.
Exactly. So I checked all these private firms that are listed there. And I called 10 of them, random, yes? 6 of them didn't exist, okay? The other 4, at random, The other 4, yes, existed, but said that they didn't know what I was talking about, okay? So it's going to be very difficult to check whether, one, it's functioning, and 2, how many people are actually being paid and how many the private firms are there. Yes, because there are firms like, for example, a little store in the street, yes, and they put these guys to as vendors, yes, and there are other firms, big firms that are receiving 1,000 youths, yes. So it's going to be. If Progresa was difficult to evaluate, this is going to be much more difficult, yes. So, and finally, I do agree with Jorge. There are many differences. AMLO holds a capital city, but most people are worried about Congress. But Andrés Manuel López Obrador, about intermediate elections, I think Andrés Manuel is much, much smarter than most of us. He's not aiming at Congress because by the end of these 3 years, he would have passed most of the laws that he wants. He's aiming at municipalities, at local governments. In 2021, all municipalities except those of 2 states will be renewed. And that's where he's heading for in electoral terms. Finally, there is no opposition to capitalize. You are
Completely
completely right. However, I am very sad, I'm very worried, I'm very concerned to tell you that whenever I go to give a conference, with the Mafia del Poder or with students or whoever, the question, and it makes me really very sad, the last regular question, or the constant question, the systematic question, is whether I see someone, not institution, no
Not a
party,
party.
not a, someone that could capitalize this discontent or the probable lowering of the popularity. So Mexicans basically are heading maybe not for a López Obrador, but then for a Bolsonaro. For me, they're both the same. I cannot say the word, but they are the same as the...
They're both populist.
Sí.
Hardly
Populist.
the same.
Yeah. So, but people are looking for someone, for a savior. It is very sad.
Well, that's a sad spot. So maybe Antonio can try to lift us
Brighten
back
it
up.
up.
Go ahead.
I don't know if I can.
Brighten it up.
Let me see if I can brighten up.
Also-
I think I
while
can do
also-
that a little bit. You asked Chris if it's possible to, for López Obrador to retain support given all these challenges. I do think it is possible for a number of reasons. Number one, and I can speak as a 100% Mexicano, no? I mean, we're all fed up with corruption. We are fed up with skewed income distribution. We are fed up that the billionaires become wealthier. And if you're born in Chiapas and Oaxaca, that's your destiny. At CIDE, I must mention this, we did manage to change the life of a few young men and a few young women from Guerrero, Oaxaca, and Chiapas. But that's a drop in the bucket, okay? And now there are budget cuts. I can see that. Don't get me going. That's a whole other issue.
Among many other
Among many
centers that
other,
are being, yeah.
among many other institutions. I mean, the diagnosis is correct. I would say it's unanimous. And the main business organization, Consejo Coordinador Empresarial, that represents the broad array of businesses, is trying to play ball with the government. It said we will invest vast amounts of money to help the South and Southeast growth. We agree that poverty rates are unacceptable. We agree that corruption is unacceptable. So under new leadership, it's trying to engage with the government. And I think that with especially domestic Mexican businesses and the government working together, a lot can be done. And also by having foreign businesses work together with domestic businesses. I don't know what to call it, but maybe a new type of import substitution under an open economy model. We can discuss it. I think it's possible to do that, to have a more activist state as long as the rules are clear. And this leads me to the last question that Duncan asked. Are there challenges regarding the distribution of gas? And I would say, yes, there are unnecessary challenges because the U.S., as you know, is now a large exporter of natural gas at low to negative prices. They don't know what to do with the gas. Mexico badly needs gas, not only for the South and Southeast, but it's also thinking about boosting development in the Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and that's related to the migration crisis. So for economic and political and social reasons, it makes eminent sense to use U.S. gas in Mexico. And it can be easily resolved if these current negotiations come to a successful conclusion. So I think that the incentives are there to come to a successful conclusion. I'll end up, because it makes sense for everyone, okay? It makes sense for everyone. So I'll end up with that more optimistic.
Thank you so much, Antonio. Thank you all. Please join me in thanking our panelists. We'll obviously have to do this again in 6 months or another year when we have more to analyze, but this is a fun panel, so thank you all.
Podríamos ya hacer un paquete, chicos.